Good evening, everyone. My name is Joel Day, and I am the Managing Director of the Notre Dame Democracy Initiative. Welcome to everybody in the audience and everyone watching live streaming on our YouTube page. Our democracy initiative envisions Notre Dame as the most trusted institution people turn to for studying and strengthening democracy. So this is one of our signature events, Democracy Talks, which aims to offer accessible and engaging opportunities for the whole Notre Dame community and broader South Bend community to better understand current events and pressing policy issues. Tonight, we are proud to bring you this program in partnership with the Keough School, the Kellogg Institute, and the Liu Institute. I'd also like to say thanks to Al and Mary Harding. Al is there in the front row for your generous support for this series. I'm going to introduce both of our fireside chat folks up here, starting with our own Dean Mary Gallagher. Dean Gallagher is a professor of global affairs and the Marilyn Keough Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Previously, she directed the International Institute at the University of Michigan, where she was also the Amy and Alan Lowenstein Chair in Democracy, Democratization, and Human Rights. She is the author or editor of 5 books, and I'll mention 2 because they intersect nicely with tonight's themes. Authoritarian Legality in China, Law, Workers, and the State from Cambridge. Contagious Capitalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Labor in China from Princeton in 2005. Ever bridging the gap between theory and practice, Mary is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, member of the National Committee on the U.S.-China Relations, and a consultant for the World Bank, U.S. Department of State, and the U.S. Department of Labor. Our guest tonight is Ambassador Chris Liu. Chris Liu is an accomplished senior leader with proven policy, diplomacy, management, and communications track records. Liu holds degrees from Princeton and Harvard Law School and served for over 20 years in the House, Senate, and White House. He oversaw the 2008 Obama-Biden transition period and planning after serving as then Senator Obama's chief of staff. In the Obama administration, Liu served as the White House Cabinet Secretary for 4 years, followed by 3 years as U.S. Deputy Secretary of Labor, and most recently served as ambassador to the United Nations for management and reform being notoriously 2 things the UN is good at. Tonight's conversation gets at one of the core issues in contemporary democracy studies, that since the end of World War II, America served, in the words of Ronald Reagan, as that shining city on a hill. And in this vision, democracy isn't something that America just promotes externally or imposes that system on others, but rather compels others to action simply by our example. The subtext here, of course, is that our city isn't so shiny on that hill anymore. And that's not just disappointing, it arguably makes America and the world less free and less safe. Ambassador, we welcome you to Notre Dame, and we look forward to learning more about why American democracy matters for the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So thank you, Ambassador.
Chris is fine.
Okay, Chris. I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to try to then check in with the audience, see if the audience has some questions, so we get a little bit more of a lively conversation, not just me asking questions to Chris. These are pretty spicy questions. I'm just preparing you. Yeah, so let's have a good conversation. So the first thing I want to talk about a bit is checks and balances, and the fact that you've been in all 3 branches of the federal government, which gives you a really great vantage point to see how these branches interact and the power dynamics between them. So could you talk a little bit how you see the branches now? Are they still co-equal? Are checks and balances working? And if not, why should we be concerned about this?
First of all, let me thank Notre Dame and all the sponsors of this session, especially the Democracy Initiative. It's great to be here talking about this important topic. It's a funny thing when we talk about democracy to start with separation of powers, but I think it's important to do that to understand what the founders intended. The founders intended 3 co-equal branches as the check on each other. It was obviously a reaction to King George and not wanting to have a king again. It, in practice, has not worked as well as I think the founders intended, in part because as the United States has gotten more complicated, more of that power has flowed to the executive. And that's not a partisan thing. I mean, that has, one of the greatest expansions of executive power happened under President Roosevelt. But I think as a result of a number of actions, not only the complexity of the federal government, the increasing importance of national security, foreign policy issues, which are more squarely in the president's bailiwick, increasing polarization, gridlock in Congress that's made them unable to function more effectively. You have had this accumulation of power in the executive branch, but nominally you still have had a legislative branch and a judicial branch that have been acted at times as checks. In preparation for today's discussion, I went back and just reread Article 1 of the Constitution. I strongly suggest people read that and look at what the founders intended. The spending power of the government flows to Congress. That would be surprising to you when you found out now that you've got an executive branch that's basically saying, hey, I don't want to spend the money that Congress is giving you. The power of commerce, it belongs to Article 1, to Congress. Again, that might surprise you as you see what's happening with tariffs. The power to declare war, I mean, that's squarely in the domain of Congress, but as we've seen really since 9/11, most of that has actually flowed to the president at this period of time. So you've got a Congress that really has not been as engaged as they should be. And obviously, as I mentioned, because of increasing polarization, it's more challenging for a Congress of the president's party to be an effective check. So we are now in the moment to see whether the judicial branch can really be that check. And I see a lot of folks here who are older, no doubt remember during Watergate when the Supreme Court very famously in Nixon versus United States by a 9-0 decision ordered President Nixon to turn over the Watergate tapes. We are now in that moment where you have not as clear a decision, but you have a decision by the Supreme Court 9-0 to facilitate the return of an El Salvadoran citizen back to the United States. And we're in that moment to see whether that happens or not. So the answer is checks and balances have not worked that well for a long period of time. This will be an interesting moment to see whether that dynamic holds or not. And we should care, I should say this, to the topic of tonight's discussion. Our Constitution really is the foundation for so many other countries' constitutions. And so if we can't make this work, it does call into question whether other less stable democracies can make it work.
On the detail of the El Salvador case, so far it's been that as I understand it, although I did not read the news so closely this morning, that the El Salvadorian president will not return him. So is that a way for this decision to be made in such a way that it's not a direct defiance of the court?
Right. The court in that case said that the executive branch should facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. They questioned whether the lower court judge could effectuate that return. They recognize that the executive branch does have predominant powers when it comes to foreign policy. And that's the language in which the president is latching onto. But functionally, they did say, you got to figure out a way to make this person come back. And yet you've had this weird, frankly, Kafka-esque, back and forth where the president says, hey, I can't order them to return it. And then the president of El Salvador says, hey, I can't return this terrorist. And so we're kind of in this standoff right now. This will ultimately go back to the Supreme Court again.
Great. Going back to checks and balances, I'm a political scientist, but I don't really study the United States. But being in grad school during the 1990s, when after the collapse of the Cold War, there was this third wave of democratization, really starting in the 80s and the 90s. And one of the things we focused on was civil society and the role of civil society in helping a transition to a more consolidated democracy. Things like universities, lawyers, media, nonprofits. These are all things that we think of as helping to make a functioning democracy. In the United States context, particularly right now, how do you see these outside organizations? How do they contribute to a functioning democracy, and how do we keep them healthy?
Yeah, and I think it's an important point because look, the Constitution sets out a very formal set of checks and balances, and yet we have an informal set of checks and balances. We have the free press, we have nonprofits, we have universities. And it's one of the reasons why US foreign policy, in particular foreign assistance, that used to flow through USAID, actually sends money out to other countries, because we understand that if you want to create a more stable country, part of it is to create these other informal institutions. I mean, the higher education is especially important. I mean, the concept of academic freedom, which is really rooted in the First Amendment, is essential. You all should have the ability, students, to say what you want. You professors should have the ability to produce whatever research they want. And that's not a partisan thing. Again, that's good for our society. We need a free press that is a check on all power in government, and we need civil society that can advocate for people who don't have a voice. Again, I think all of those things are under attack in this country. As we pivot, those are kind of the essential elements of how we help strengthen democracies and help build democracies overseas.
Is this a separate, like, kind of a sub question? Is the use right now of federal funding to the universities as a political lever, is that new? Is this the first time that you've seen it being used in the way?
So it is the case that the federal government, in its power to give out grants, can put requirements on outside contractors. It is less clear whether you can do that. This is obviously an ongoing debate right now. Look at what the government has asked Harvard to do. Okay, there's clearly a bucket of issues where you need to address your policies about protecting Jewish students. You need to address anti-Semitism. Harvard has said, look, we absolutely need to do that. But what they are also saying is that we have the ability to go into each one of your schools and each one of your programs to look at the professors, look at the students, look at the diversity of viewpoints. I mean, that cuts right into the heart of academic freedom. And it is one thing to say, look, I don't like this program that you have at Harvard or any other university, so I'm not going to fund this program. That we could argue that's legitimate. But to say, I don't like this program, so I'm going to defund cancer research over here, which is not even implicated, that's an entirely separate issue. And I think that's where this kind of reaches well beyond what it may be a legitimate goal.
It reminds me of an encounter I had at the University of Michigan with Confucius Institutes, where the reason why I thought the Confucius Institute, which closed in 2018, was a violation of academic freedom is because they had so much more say over the programming that we did within the Confucius Institute at the university, compared to the Title VI and FLAS grants that we got from the Department of Education for area studies and foreign language. And it was really a stark difference to see that in the US case, except for the Middle East studies, actually, they did try to ask for diversity of views. And so that's where I first started to see the kind of intervention that's really ramped up now, where you see much more direct intervention across the board in many, many areas, and then using funding in STEM to threaten those programs.
I mean, it's one thing to say, we want to do research on this topic, so we're going to fund this, or we don't want you to research this area, so we're going to defund it. It's a whole nother thing to say we only want you to research it, and we only want you to have this viewpoint in that research. That's entirely different.
And that will take away your funding.
That will take away your funding, exactly.
Yeah. Let's switch a little bit to talk about how foreign countries are viewing the United States in this moment. You just came from the United Nations. How closely do other nations watch American democracy?
Everything. I mean, the United Nations is a remarkable organization. 193 countries are represented there. Holy See as well as represented there as an observer. So in one, couple block area, you have the entire world. And the lifeblood of the UN is just conversations. It's all the conversations we're having in the hallway. It's receptions. It's informal. It's formal gatherings. So you hear everything. I'll give a good example. The big event that the U.S. mission holds is the July 4th party. Last year, our July 4th party was held a couple of days after that first presidential debate between President Biden and President Trump. And I remember somebody coming up to me and said, from another country, is that the best your country has to offer? They uniformly, the ambassadors watched that debate. They know keenly what is happening in our country on a day-to-day basis. They know the history of our country. This is not that they just know George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. They know minutia about our country in a way that we don't know. So everything we do, everything we say, they are aware of. And again, we'll talk more about this, but they use those incidents. They use the flaws or the failings or the successes of our country against us. They will, and again, I know we'll talk a little bit about the Chinese, which I know is an area of interest and specialty for you. But when we try to criticize the Chinese on their treatment of the Uyghur minority, they will talk about our treatment of Native Americans. They will talk about the George Floyd protests. They will talk about the homeless crisis. They will talk about crime in New York. They know it to that level of specificity. So, and they throw that back against us. The Russians love to use that as propaganda. And so we are in a war of ideas and values around the world. And so what happens here is intricately affects the rest of the world.
Yes, that is, I think back to going back many years with the human rights white paper that the Chinese government would issue on the United States every year. And it'd be so interesting to read it because it was basically how they were interpreting the problems of American democracy. Just on that issue with China in particular, and you mentioned national security as a reason for why we see the concentration of power in the executive, how does the increasing competition between the United States and China, how has it affected democracy in the United States?
Explain that a little bit more.
I think a lot of the ways in which we see the need, the justification for certain actions to be about making America stronger vis-a-vis China, a lot of that has motivated things like the China Initiative at the FBI, research security at American universities. I mean, even some of the attacks now that we
Confucius
see,
Institutes.
Confucius Institutes.
Right.
I think when Christopher Wray came into the FBI and was launching, the Department of Justice launched the China Initiative, they said that American universities are the soft underbelly that are easily sort of penetrated by enemies abroad. So there's a way in which I feel like even though the United States I see right now doing things that are detrimental to, say, our research standing and how universities have contributed so much to U.S. science and technology, but the attacks are being justified by the fact that we are part of the problem.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, if there's one bipartisan thing in Washington, it is distrust, it is opposition to China. And it's absolutely the case that China is our greatest competitor at this period of time. I will tell you, as an Asian American, and frankly, as a Chinese American, the history of Asian Americans in this country is not a particularly good history. You go back to the Chinese Exclusion Act and fears that Chinese laborers would take away jobs. You go back to Japanese American internment. You go back to hostility against Japanese buying up Rockefeller Center and other properties in New York. And you move fast forward and you look at Asian hate incidents, during COVID. And so the concern has always been, at least in the Asian American community, that what is a legitimate concern about China and the rise of China will then have collateral damage for people here in the United States. It is the case that American universities are the soft underbelly. It is absolutely the case that the Chinese are trying to steal information, or steal maybe a little strong, obtain information through American research universities. But where does that lead? Does that lead to scapegoating of Asian American scientists? It is absolutely the case that Confucius Institutes may be a front for the Chinese Communist Party, but we have plenty of foreign governments that actually pay for research institutes here in the United States, Middle East being a prominent one. We have laws in this country in many states now that prohibit Chinese from owning land That may be or may not be a legitimate thing. So it's a very, very hard thing, and this broad umbrella of national security is being used to justify a lot of things. And we've seen the parallels. We saw what happened post 9/11 with the Patriot Act, and how that was used to justify greater surveillance against Americans. And so we need to separate what the real danger is, but do that in a way that protects our civil liberties.
We know a lot, and we talk a lot about the domestic effects of polarization, partisanship in the United States. You mentioned gridlock. From the vantage point of being at the UN, how do you see the partisan polarization in the United States as affecting our foreign policy or our perceived reliability?
Well, it's not just the polarization, but it's the pretty radical pendulum swings we've seen in the last two shifts in administration. I mean, again, it is the case. Let me give you a perfect example. NATO. It has been the case that this alliance that we formed after World War II, which has persevered and succeeded through Democratic and Republican administrations, is now on shaky ground right now. And NATO is the world's greatest, longest enduring, most powerful alliance. That concerns our allies, frankly. Tariffing our two closest neighbors concerns our allies. But as much it's the gridlock makes people wonder whether America's democracy should be the model for other countries around the world. I mean, as you know this well, there are two competing theories of how countries should grow. There's kind of the messy democratic way we have in the United States, where we believe that political rights can coexist with economic prosperity. There is the Chinese model, which is we are going to prioritize economic development. We are going to tamp down any kind of political rights. It's going to be a much more autocratic way of running things. And there are times where the Chinese model doesn't look that bad to a lot of developing countries. I mean, it is the case to say that if you are talking to a very poor country and you say, look, we as the United States think you should prioritize freedom of the press. And they're like, look, we can't feed our people. We have no healthcare. And the Chinese are offering them the assistance and suggesting that their model is better. And so it is a competition of ideas that we try to fight on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Are we winning that fight right now?
I don't know that we are winning that fight right now. And it's not just US democracy. I would say it's Western democracy more broadly. I mean, you have seen in recent years kind of a very powerful nativist sentiment that's kind of swept across Europe as well. And look, there are fundamental underlying reasons for this. I mean, we can say that we got globalization absolutely wrong. Jobs left these places. They went to other places where there was cheaper labor. We did not take care of the working people here in this country. Western Europe did not take care of their working people there. So we've been in a situation where it becomes very easy to say, you know what, the answer to that is we blame immigrants, we shut our borders, we adopt more isolationist policies. And so there is a genuine economic instability that has fueled a political instability.
This is a different question. It's not on my sheet, so I don't know if you want to answer it.
Sure.
And it might be something that you don't feel expert in. Since you've been in the Obama administration and the Biden administration. What I'm trying to understand is not so, in addition to the partisanship and the polarization, is that the divide within the Republican Party, particularly around foreign policy. For I guess the labels we would put on them are the neoconservatives versus the MAGA. How do you see those two parts of the party functioning right now within the Trump administration? I often attribute some of the chaos that I see due to the unresolved conflict between these two factions. So do you want to answer any part of that question?
I'll answer all of it. No, I mean, look, for better or worse, our competition, U.S. competition with Russia or Soviet Union has been the defining competition since World War II. There was no bigger Cold Warrior than Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan standing and saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down the wall," traced back to JFK saying virtually the same thing 20 years earlier. And so following the invasion of Ukraine in February of 22, there was bipartisan support for Ukraine. I mean, and for a variety of reasons. It's Russia attacking a democracy, an imperfect one, but still a democracy. It is aggression that we want to deter, because we understand that if we don't deter the aggression there, we will see what will happen with Taiwan coming down the road. It is fundamentally moving one step closer to attacking NATO. It is the concept that's, one of the central tenets that underlie the United Nations, which is territorial integrity. You don't just attack your neighbors. Now, to be fair, the U.S. attacks countries all the time, so we are certainly not perfect ourselves. But for a variety of reasons, you would have found traditionally no disagreement between Democrats and Republicans on whether we should defend Ukraine. And yet there is a part of the Republican Party, and I still don't believe it is a majority, certainly within Congress, although it'll be interesting to see whether the I think there are far more Republicans in Congress who would support Ukraine than not support Ukraine at this point. I think there are far more people, and I think you even see people like, Senator McConnell, who has no great love for people on the other side of the aisle, standing up very forcefully for Ukraine. And I think because he understands. Now, we can have this whole broad argument about whether this kind of diametrically opposed view we've had with Russia has actually made us safer anyway. Is the war in Ukraine worth the cost? Should there be a ceasefire right now? Should we continue to provide arms? We can have all of those, but just the basic idea that we would defend a democracy against Russia used to not be a controversial thing.
Is for the part of the party that doesn't see support of Ukraine as in U.S. national interest, are those the people who are perhaps more interested in a sphere of influence model that we go back to? It's both isolationist but also expansionist at the same time.
Yeah, no, you've started to see that come up, and I'll be interested to see whether that is how it plays out. And for folks that are not aware, it's basically the idea that, I guess, U.S. and China and maybe Russia as the three main countries, although I think most people don't, other than militarily, Russia, I think their economy is smaller than Italy, actually. That somehow we three countries get to we get to have our sphere of influence. We basically go back to Monroe Doctrine, and we get the entire Latin America. China gets Asia, and then I guess Russia gets up to Eastern Europe. That is a theory of the case. There was also, the theory that this is kind of an interesting bank shot, because if we get Russia back on our side, then that gives us another ally and pulls towards China. It's unclear.
I have other questions, but I also know lots of people are here with smart questions of their own. So I'm going to open it up just to see what people are thinking. And then if there aren't questions, I will go back to my list.
All right. Semi-intelligent questions.
Or unintelligent.
We'll take any questions.
Now you're really going to silence people, Joel.
Okay. Please introduce yourself too.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Lauren. I'm a Master Global Affairs student here in Keough. And I guess my question is, I'm taking a class on international organizations. And kind of a big question of this class regards the liberal international order. And so I'm wondering if you're able to, you've touched a little bit on NATO, you've touched a little bit about democracy, but what do you see as the future of the liberal international order with China playing a larger influence?
Yeah, this is, I always explain to people this, whether it's liberal international order, it's not liberal in the way we think about it. It's like the rules-based, Western-based international order is like the world's greatest home field advantage. You think about the United Nations, which was a creation of President Roosevelt, President Truman. We headquartered, we set up all the rules. We control we control the World Bank. That's just we just do that. So we have the greatest home field advantage. Now, we don't always win, but we win more often than we want. So we have shaped, and the Chinese know that. And every time we use the phrase rules-based international order, they say, well, it's a Western-based international order. But it is a system that has brought, some measure of peace and stability to the world. It has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty. It has addressed humanitarian crises. It's ingrained the concept of human rights into the work of the UN. And to be clear, human rights is truly a Western concept. It's not that's a post-World War II thing that Eleanor Roosevelt helped develop. So we have constructed this world in which we as the United States always are the leading voice. More often than not, this order serves our purposes, allows us to express our views, to criticize countries we don't like. And in many ways, we can shield ourselves sometimes from criticism ourselves. It is under assault right now for a variety of reasons. And make no mistake, we saw this every day at the United Nations. We were in hand-to-hand combat with the Chinese, rhetorically in terms of values. And the Chinese have a huge advantage over us because they don't have to deal with elections every 2 and 4 years. They can basically say, look, for the next 30 years, here's how we're going to take over these organizations. We're going to put people in there. Those people are going to report to Beijing. Every chance we get, we're going to take Xi Jinping's words and we're going to try to put those words into UN documents. So instead of reflecting Western values, they now reflect Chinese values. This pendulum swinging, this ping-ponging, whatever you want to say, of the US, where we sometimes care about these organizations, sometimes we don't, gives now them the upper hand. And so I tell people, look, if you don't think the UN serves US interests, that's fair. But just give it a couple years and you're really going to hate it because it will be completely under the control or more under the control of the Chinese. And that's a world order that doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't make us safe. It doesn't promote a more democratic world. So it is under assault. I think the other reason it's under assault, frankly, is because of the money. The US is the largest financial contributor to the UN. We gave twice as much, or we gave twice as much to the UN as the second biggest country, which is Germany. We give 5 times more money than China gives. So that money buys us influence. If you pull that money back, you're losing your influence.
Okay, I saw another hand over here somewhere. No?
Right there.
What's that? You're the person. You are the question.
Hi, Ambassador. I just want to say thank you for coming and speaking with us today. My name's Steven. I know we met earlier, but I'm a Global Affairs and Latino Studies major with a minor in ESS, and I actually just left my intro to ESS class. I finished the class, but it just finished before I came over here. And for, I want to say 75% of the class, we were just talking about recent changes and recent news involving Columbia, Harvard, and other higher institutions and how they're responding to what the federal government has said. And you mentioned that in your statement about informal checks and balances and these organizations that can have those informal checks and balances. And especially as we're seeing a very direct and clear statement coming from Harvard University. And we've also heard that Princeton University and these other presidents plan to do the same. And they've even taken measures such as Harvard to pull out loans from international banks and making these international connections. What do you think is the future of higher ed institutions communicating and, I don't want to say collaborating, but the way that they work with the federal government?
Yeah, and again, obviously the topic of today's conversation is how this affects democracy overseas, so let's just take a step back. We've talked about free press, we've talked about civil society, we've talked about universities. I don't even have to go look at countries like China or Russia to make the comparison about how they don't have a free press, they don't really have civil society. I could go to places like Turkey and Hungary, which are NATO allies, and you've seen the erosion of those informal checks and balances. You've seen, President Erdogan in Turkey just fire judges so he could put judges of his own party in. We've seen in Hungary, President Orban, the media is basically all state-owned. And so those are erosions that you see happen. Now, I guess we would still sort of nominally call them kind of democracy-ish. But higher university is one of those things that makes, if you want to think about America's contribution to the world, our education system kind of is it. Free public education and the system we have of higher education really is the envy of the world. It is why so many international students want to come and do their educations here. It's not just the academic freedom, but it's the scientific, it's the medical research that happens in these universities that really is leading to, cancer discoveries, COVID vaccines, whatever it is. And so if federal government pulls back the money, legitimately or not, I don't know who funds all that. And I don't know, and it's going to be hard to sort of see how that erosion affects all of the things. I mean, I'm an alum of Princeton and Harvard, so I'm of places that do massive, massive research. And I don't pretend to understand any of that. I know that Princeton has some fusion reactor, which I don't even understand what it is, but I know it's important and it leads to a lot of important scientific discoveries. So it's going to fundamentally reshape, and the problem is there is no entity comparable to the federal government that can make up that funding. It's not foundations, it is not the private sector. So, there's many troubling aspects, but I think that's the most tangible aspect that I think will be hurt.
I think it's probably also the thing that the Chinese government is looking at with most kind of glee, because it's the one area where the US and China have been competing for a long time. China has really made remarkable strides, but the number of Chinese students that come to the United States to seek out graduate degrees, even now undergraduate degrees, hasn't really gone down dramatically, even after COVID. And I think there's almost a misunderstanding, and maybe it's that universities haven't done a good job to tell the story. What the relationship between the federal government and universities is that they basically subcontract out research. I mean, they can't do that amount of research on their own, and we provide these independent venues. We train people, we give them tenure. It's a very meritocratic system, and it cannot be replaced. Right? The federal government dollars cannot be replaced by private corporations or by foundations. And so who does that research if the government doesn't subcontract it to universities?
I mean, people think about big government research institutions like the NIH, like our energy labs, and those unquestionably are very, very big. But as you point out, most of their work is done in collaboration or subcontracted with universities. Meanwhile, we're actually seeing cuts in NIH and CDC and FDA and other places like that. So, and it's hard sometimes to explain to the American people why basic research is so important and leads to all of the developments, whether it's medical discoveries, whether it's improvements in AI that will fundamentally transform our lives.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm Riley Kuipers. I'm a senior majoring in global affairs and Spanish and minoring in civil and human rights and European studies. I have a pretty big question for you. What will it take and what will it look like to rebuild our institutions into the future, to rebuild our alliances after this administration, and to safeguard this from happening again, to safeguard our democracy in general, and to safeguard all of these things from happening again in a new administration? So it's a pretty big question, but hopefully you can get some insight.
So look, I mean, I'm older than you, and there are people who I think are older than me here who I think have seen the arc of history. And I think, let's start where we started this conversation on checks and balances. After Watergate, there were a series of reforms that were put in place that changed how we finance elections, that changed the power of the president, that the president could not simply not spend money. Apparently, that's now changed. But there were a series of Watergate reforms that sort of rebalanced the country, and I think rebalanced the system of government. I think that will, that could certainly be a moment going forward. I mean, I think, look, money in elections is a problem that clearly has to change right now. The fact that 2 weeks ago you had a election for a Wisconsin Supreme Court seat that each side had $100 million being spent. I mean, that's unheard of. So I think that's our system of government. Our alliances, I fear that our friends are moving on without us right now. And I think, it's not just our friends are moving on. I think those friends those countries that we've been trying to curry favor with are going to look for more reliable partners. And frankly, at this point, China is a more reliable partner than we are. I think the government, is going to be harder. I mean, look, it is absolutely the case that there's waste and fraud in the federal government. It's absolutely the case that it's too big. But I think what troubles me about what's happening right now is the way in which these cuts are happening. Let's stipulate government should be run like a business. Great. If that's the case, you would not cut your talent pipeline to your business. What is happening right now is the honors attorneys program for law school graduates go to the Justice Department. That's being cut. There's no foreign service exam this spring, so no new foreign service people. The presidential management fellow program, which is where a lot of grad students get their entree, that's all being cut. So you're gonna have a gap of people where there are no young people coming into the federal government, and that gap is going to live on for the next couple of decades. So look, we could argue about whether government should be too big, and I look at government agencies all the time and say, I don't know why this thing exists, which is great. But I do think literally the chainsaw method in which these happen, I think is going to fundamentally degrade services. The only question is at what point it becomes apparent to the American people. I do think in general, I think we need to tell a better story about why government matters to people. I was saying earlier today, I think on the spectrum of government services that people understand, I don't think I'll ever be able to explain to most people in this country why foreign assistance matters. And I can try to make the argument about it's buying crops from farmers and to feed people overseas. And if those people get fed, they might be more prosperous and more stable and buy more of our products. But I don't think I can explain that. On the other end of the spectrum, planes falling out of the sky might be something people understand. But then there's this whole gray area in between, including government research, where we know it matters, but I'm not sure we will ever be able to explain it well. But we need to explain it.
Are there others, maybe non-students, faculty, et cetera, who have questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Appreciate you being here. And thanks to the university and the Democracy Initiative for sponsoring this. We're watching in our own country, civil society, in terms of the attacks on nonprofits, higher education, the free press, the ability to hire your own lawyer, and things like that are fundamental. And if we look at the authoritarian playbook that Orban and others have used, they're kind of going page by page, just they're speed reading it. And it's all well and good to talk about, in the next administration. I think that's a big assumption right now, the way things are happening so quickly, and there's such a rapid collapse of the system. And I think that the American people are looking for some solutions as well as leadership. And that's why I think people have applauded the 4 law firms that stood up, are applauding Harvard now. People are looking for some leadership. But do you have some ideas on solutions on what we can do? Because if our democracy fails, as you were suggesting, the other countries in the world will then start slipping over the edge as well. So any solutions for us?
Boy, that's more than I think the 15 minutes we have. I will say this. A very smart person who used to be the mayor of South Bend, Pete Buttigieg, spoke after me at a conference recently. And he was saying, the funny thing is when you look in authoritarian governments, countries, people aren't on the streets saying, rah, rah, I love the autocrat. They're heads down. They know that, I'm going to mind my own business. There are certain things I'm allowed to talk about. There are certain things I'm not allowed to talk about. And it's a trade. And again, you know this well in China. Mm-hmm. You can talk about capitalism. You could talk about your business all day long. But boy, don't talk about Xi Jinping, or don't talk about Tiananmen Square. Mm-hmm. Don't talk about what's happening in Hong Kong in terms of crackdown. Because, be careful about what you search on you can't search the internet for everything. I mean, just be careful. Mm-hmm. And I think that is this is not a political statement. It's complacency. It's falling into that heads down. We're going to keep it ourselves. I mean, I think this is a moment again. Look, we have a problem of voter participation in the country. We have a problem of civic engagement in this country. Ultimately, I mean, the people can take back power in this country. And this is a moment when we could all use a little bit of courage. And I think, we can look to what happens in other countries. And again, democratic movements, rise and fall around the world. Some of them go very, very well. I'm old enough to remember, people dancing on the Berlin Wall and jumping over and seeing what I'm old enough to remember Lech Walesa in Poland. I remember Arab Spring and how that really kind of rose and then fell. I mean, the people around the world are the ones that need to rise up and take power. I do believe, and I am an optimist, that our American democracy is a fundamentally resilient democracy. Our institutions, I think, can withstand anything. And I think, so, and again, going back to the topic of this talk, I am concerned, though, that the example we set for other countries makes it more difficult for those institutions to hold where they are not as stable and structured as what we have here.
Okay. Hi.
Thank you both for your presence. I want to tag along with that question. I've been watching a lot because I want to know what to do. And Bernie Sanders and AOC have gone around the country and they're doing a good job with all the demonstrations. Are they effective? Is that the way we speak out? What are the ways for us to speak out?
So I don't want to get too far afield. I guess I would simply say, again, going back to what I said before, engagement matters. Now, I don't think marching for the sake of marching matters, except to show that I'm not going to be in a head down crouch, a defensive crouch. I'm going to show my presence. And I think somebody, when you see other people out there, I mean, I think this is again, we are not Harvard University. I'm not Harvard University, but when Harvard University, the wealthiest school says, look, we are going to stand up for academic freedom, that empowers other people to do that. So I do think people in their own ways, institutions in their own way, law firms, take a stand. And I think that has relevance.
Speaking of law firms and taking the stance, but how about law departments and colleges and universities taking a joint stance against what's happening in the Justice Department and the manipulation of the law?
I agree. I mean, I think everyone needs to take it's a hard thing, I think, given the chilling atmosphere that we are operating right now and this constant threat of funds being, and people, I think, forget, I mean, universities can be very dependent on federal funding.
So Victoria Hui, professor in political science. I want to say one thing, that this morning I invited democracy defenders from Nicaragua to come talk to my class. And one of the graphs he showed, taken from VDEM, is that, look, at Nicaragua, it used to be pretty high in terms of democracy score, and now it is right above Afghanistan. And then at the same time, you'll hear him and Victoria talk about, we still have to have hope. We still take matters in our own hands. We still continue to fight. I think we have, as Americans, I'm from Hong Kong and I'm in exile, and you don't give up. And I think that Americans have never really, basically with the rights to vote, have never taken all these other things that you could do seriously. Watch what other people have been doing around the world. Why in South Korea, in Seoul, that, the guy who tried to impose martial law would be overthrown? Every single Korean in Seoul took matters in his or her own hand. Not sitting around, oh, what can Bernie Sanders do for me? What can AOC do for me? What can Obama do for me? What can Biden do for me? I think everyone in us has to ask, what can I do?
Yeah, I got to tell you, like, in terms of democratic uprisings, if you look at what happened in South Korea, that was amazing. Declares martial law and the streets of Seoul are flooded. He backs down, I think, like 8 hours later. This is kind of, but I do want to talk about one thing, which we, think about civic engagement, think about voter participation. We got to do much better on voter participation. And as we think about the democracy initiative and what more we can do, 2024 election, which was a high intensity election, it was 64%. I checked the other 64% voter participation, 64%. I found this fascinating study from the Pew research that again, based on the 2020 election, which was another high turnout election, they looked at the 50 countries in the OECD. So like, these are largely the industrialized countries. We were 31st out of 50 in terms of voter participation. We fall between Colombia and Greece. I mean, yes, we all need to get up and do what we can, but the first thing we need to do is vote. I don't care who you vote for, you just got to get out and vote. And I think that's an issue where and in fact, the irony in this country is we work to make it harder and harder for people to vote. I was looking at, I just came back from a vacation in Australia. People may know this. Australia, you're required to vote. And if you don't vote, you got fined $20 or 20 Australian dollars. And not surprisingly, they have a 90-some% voter participation rate. And it's not just good because it's not just good for civic engagement, but it gives more legitimacy to what the government is doing. So, and let me just say this: it's not just federal elections. I mean, let's not go down the road of state, local elections, how few people vote. And for most people in this country, what happens at the state and local level is far more impactful on your everyday lives. And most people just don't care to show up for those elections at all.
I like what you said earlier, and I want to pick up on that, and that is our economic system is under duress. And I think tariffs are a terrible curse because they will undermine our economic growth significantly. So my question is, should that be one of the primary goals of a democratic process, to point out that this is a fallacy? Because it will undermine further the well-being of the people. The other question I have is actually a legal approach that I heard by reading or hearing about the book about Johnson & Johnson. And basically the author was saying, if you give me $20 million, I go to all those lawyers and start disbarment procedures for all the stuff that they knew was incorrect, that they attested to in court. And I mean, one could take this one step further and say, okay, any lawyer that comes from the government has to basically swear an oath that what they're saying is correct.
Wait, remind me the first part of your question was?
Tariffs.
Oh, tariffs. No, I mean, look, it is absolutely the case that we in the United States got globalization wrong. And you see that playing out in places like South Bend, Indiana. I mean, there is a generation of workers, and I say this now, one of my old hat as the Deputy Secretary of Labor. We thought by allowing China to enter the global trading regime, the WTO, that they would be a responsible trading partner and that we would lift everybody up. It is absolutely the case that those jobs all flowed from the United States. Now, there are a variety of reasons why they flowed out of the United States. But it is absolutely the case that we have not done anything or not done enough to help those people. That economic duress has led to political instability, not just here in the United States, but in other Western countries. But it's also the case. I mean, this is, I think, the thing that people sometimes forget about tariffs, which is, look, if you walk into your Walmart and you want to buy an $8 t-shirt or you want to buy a $200 TV, which you can absolutely do, they're not going to be made in the United States. That's just not going to happen. Our labor costs are far too high for that. But it is the case that we can bring back manufacturing, but it's a certain type of manufacturing. It's going to be advanced manufacturing, or it's going to be manufacturing that's made with components that come from other countries. The idea that we are going to make an entire iPhone here in the United States from all U.S. products, U.S. like parts, will just it's either not, it's cost prohibitive, and it does not reflect how our global economy works.
We have time for 2 more questions. I'm going to have this one right in front of me, and then over here.
Hi, my name is Rin. I'm an econ and applied math student here. You mentioned earlier, kind of when talking about people losing faith in like the American democracy and like the American way, being called out on like other issues. How do you respond to like that, like accusations of hypocrisy, and how do like we as Americans give you more like ammo to combat those claims?
So look, I actually, I mean, you know, there are people who will say that we overly apologized in the Obama administration, the Biden administration, for the sins of this country. I do think that it's important for we as Americans to conduct ourselves with humility and modesty and self-awareness. It is absolutely the case that we have not treated our indigenous people in the right way. It is absolutely the case that we have racial disparities. We have massive economic inequalities in this country. We have a huge homeless problem. It is the case that our capitalist system has not worked to everyone's advantage. We can't sort of paper over this and say, no, we're the greatest thing. We have no mistakes. I think we have to admit, and I think what makes us different in the United States versus, again, China, Russia, is that we are willing to admit we have not been perfect, but we are always striving to be better. We always believe in these fundamental values, even if we have not always lived up to them. I think that's a healthy way for us as Americans to conduct ourselves overseas. The idea that we do no wrong, I think there's already a skepticism about American values, American exceptionalism. But I think to recognize that, yeah, we haven't gotten always right, but we've gotten it more right than other countries have.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I'm not American. I'm from Colombia. And I want to ask myself, because I live in this country and I love this university and my job. So what can I do to contribute in this moment where I think that it's not just the erosion of democratic institutions that we are witnessing and even participating in, but also values. And I think that one aspect that we haven't talked about so far is polarization. Because I wonder, how do we expand the middle so that we can start reaching those that are in the extreme? I think that self-awareness and self-reflection should also lead us there, not just to criticize those that are supporting this particular type of regime, but I think there has to be an effort of understanding and reaching out.
No, maybe this is a perfect way to end, which is one of the reasons why, when I first having these conversations with Joel about coming here, why I want to come here is this is not like the two schools I went to, Princeton and Harvard. This conversation, the audience we reach, the student body, the alumni are a qualitatively different, far more ideologically diverse group of people. And I think it's important to have these conversations. I mean, I need to get out of my New York to DC bubble and come and have these conversations and hear from people. So I think, look, I mean, it is hard because the nature of how we live, where we work, even if you try to have these conversations, you're not necessarily, you have to go out and, like I was saying to folks, I live on a street in suburban Washington, DC, where every single person is either a government employee or a government adjacent employee. Like we don't have much diversity. I mean, yes, one person works for the FBI, the other person works for the State Department, but that's the level of diversity we have on our street. So I have to really go far and wide to find different people to talk to. Maybe being at a place like this where you are getting students from a broad cross-section here in the country, broad cross-section in the world, these are the conversations, and this is why I want to come here.
So I just wanted to end by saying that in another talk that we had this semester by Professor Danielle Allen at Harvard, I think the recommendation that she gave and that you gave on civic engagement and particularly local and state participation and political participation are the same. And I think that's really interesting. Totally different backgrounds, different talks, but in the end, giving very similar recommendations to us. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
For the next 30 or 45 minutes, we have a small reception outside. Please join the ambassador and everybody here for more conversation. And please mark your calendars for next Wednesday. Next Wednesday? Yeah, for 2 DOJ officials who were fired during President Trump's first week. They were part of the prosecution team of the United States versus Trump. They are in conversation with the law school dean, Marcus Cole, next Wednesday night at 5 o'clock over in the law school. And then the following Monday, we have another democracy talk with 4 university institute and center directors talking about the first 100 days retrospective of Trump 2.0. Thanks a lot.